Picture this. It's 1945, and Europe lies in ruins. Cities flattened, factories destroyed, millions dead. But across the Atlantic, one nation stands untouched: America. The only major power with its industrial base intact, its economy booming from wartime production. And in the smoke and ash of World War II, a handful of men in Washington saw not just a humanitarian crisis, but an opportunity. An opportunity to reshape the entire global financial system. Now, before we dive deep into this story, I want you to do something. Look at any dollar bill in your wallet. See those words, "In God we trust"? Well, after 1945, the whole world was forced to trust in the dollar. But it wasn't always this way. For nearly 200 years, London was the financial capital of the world. British pounds, backed by gold flowing from Canada, Australia, South Africa, the Commonwealth was an economic fortress. And what we're about to uncover is how a few American officials used something that looked like charity, the Marshall Plan, to break that fortress apart, piece by piece. If this kind of deep dive into hidden history interests you, hit that like button now and subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal took me weeks of research to piece together, and most people have no idea this even happened. So let's go back to July 1944. The war in Europe isn't even over yet, but 730 delegates from 44 countries gather at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Beautiful mountain setting, summer weather. But in those conference rooms, something historic is happening. The man running the show is Harry Dexter White, a senior US Treasury official. Facing him across the negotiating table is the legendary British economist John Maynard Keynes. Now Keynes arrives with a plan. He wants to create something called Bancor, an international currency that no single nation controls. It would have protected Britain's empire trade system, allowed countries to keep managing their own gold and currency flows. Essentially, it would have kept London at the center of global finance. But White says no. America has a different vision. The dollar, pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, would become the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would peg to the dollar. And there's a new institution, the International Monetary Fund, that would enforce these rules. Keynes is brilliant, maybe the smartest economist of the century, but he's negotiating from weakness. Britain is nearly bankrupt from the war, bleeding money, dependent on American supplies. After 2 weeks of debate, White wins. The Bretton Woods system is born. The dollar is now legally bound to gold, and every other currency is bound to the dollar. But here's what most history books won't tell you. This was just step one. Because Britain still had something powerful, the Commonwealth trade system. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India. These countries traded primarily with Britain and each other, using British pounds, sending their gold and dollars to London to be pooled together. This system, called the sterling area, meant that even though Britain was broke, it could still access the resources and wealth of a quarter of the planet. And this drove certain people in Washington absolutely crazy. Enter William Clayton. He's the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, a cotton merchant millionaire from Texas who built his fortune on exports. Clayton believed with almost religious fervor that imperial trade preferences, these special low tariff deals Britain had with its Commonwealth partners, were choking American business. See, back in 1932, during the Great Depression, Britain and its dominions had met in Ottawa, Canada, and agreed to cut tariffs on trade with each other, while raising walls against outsiders, especially Americans. This was called imperial preference. For American exporters, it was infuriating. You could make the best, cheapest product in the world, but a Canadian buyer would still choose a more expensive British version because the tariff made the American one cost more. By some estimates, this system redirected about 20 to 30% of trade toward Britain and away from the United States. Clayton saw his mission clearly: destroy imperial preference, open up those Commonwealth markets, and he had a weapon: American money. By 1947, Europe was in crisis. The winter had been brutal, the coldest in decades. Food shortages everywhere. France and Italy had strong communist parties that might win elections. Britain was rationing bread, something they hadn't even done during the war. George Marshall, the US Secretary of State, announced a plan. America would give massive economic aid to rebuild Europe. Officially, it was about humanitarian relief and stopping communism. But Clayton and his team saw it differently. They saw leverage. Here's how it worked. Britain desperately needed that Marshall Plan money. Eventually, they'd receive $3.3 billion, the largest share of any country. But there were conditions. Not written directly into the Marshall Plan legislation, mind you. That would have been too obvious. No, the pressure came through other channels. The Americans insisted that to receive Marshall aid, European countries had to join something called the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. Sounds boring and technical, right? But this organization had a purpose: to break down trade barriers between European nations and, critically, to move toward multilateral trade. That's code for ending discriminatory trade preferences, like the ones Britain had with Canada and Australia. At the same time, negotiations were happening in Geneva for something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. And who's leading the American team? William Clayton. And what's his main demand? That Britain starts dismantling imperial preference. Not all at once, that would cause a revolt in London, but gradually. Article 1 of GATT established something called most favored nation treatment. If you give a trade benefit to one country, you have to offer it to all GATT members. Now pause for a second and think about this. If you're watching this and finding these connections interesting, drop a comment below telling me what you think. Was this a conspiracy or just smart diplomacy? I'm curious what you believe. The British negotiators knew exactly what was happening. In the UK Parliament, members were openly complaining that America was using Britain's desperate need for dollars to force policy changes that benefited Wall Street and American corporations. But what choice did they have? British gold reserves had fallen to just £620 million by the end of 1945. They were burning through money trying to feed their population, rebuild bomb-damaged cities, maintain their military commitments around the world. And here's where the story gets really interesting. The gold flows. See, Canada and Australia were massive gold producers. Canadian mines, Australian mines, South African mines. They pulled millions of ounces out of the ground every year. And traditionally, that gold flowed to London. It was pooled in the Bank of England, strengthening Britain's reserves, backing the pound sterling. This made London the centre of global gold trading. But after Bretton Woods, gold had a fixed price in dollars, $35 per ounce. And New York was becoming more attractive for gold trading. Why? Because America had dollars, and dollars were now the only currency other than gold that everyone wanted. If you were a Canadian mining company and you sold your gold in London, you'd get pounds. But what could you do with pounds? Britain had strict currency controls. You couldn't easily convert them to dollars to buy American machinery or goods. But if you sold your gold in New York, instant dollars, liquid, convertible, accepted everywhere. The Americans didn't have to force this change. They just had to make the alternative impossible. In July 1947, under pressure from the Americans, Britain tried to make the pound convertible, meaning anyone could exchange pounds for dollars. The idea was to prove the pound could compete with the dollar. It was a disaster. In just 5 weeks, over $1 billion worth of pounds were converted and fled the country. Britain was forced to suspend convertibility on August 20th. The humiliation was complete. And where did those dollars go? Many flowed to New York, to Wall Street. Because that's where the gold was, where the stability was, where the future was being built. Now I need to pause here because we're at a crucial point in the story. The conspiracy, if we want to call it that, is starting to work. Imperial tariffs are beginning to crack under GATT pressure. Gold is starting to shift from London to New York. The sterling area is weakening, but the most dramatic part of this story is still to come. Before I continue, I really need you to do something for me. If you're finding this valuable, if you're learning things they didn't teach you in school, hit that subscribe button. Click the bell icon so you don't miss part 2. Because what happens next, between 1948 and 1950, is when everything comes together. When the conspiracy, the pressure, the financial engineering all pays off. And there are names you need to know. People who made this happen behind closed doors. So we left off in August 1947. Britain's attempt to make the pound convertible has failed catastrophically. The country is bleeding dollars, gold reserves are draining, and in Washington, a small group of men are watching very carefully. Because they know the endgame is approaching. Let me introduce you to the key players in this final phase. You already know William Clayton, the anti-imperial trade warrior at the State Department. But there are others. Paul Nitze, who worked under Clayton and would later become one of the architects of the Cold War strategy. Averell Harriman, a railroad fortunaire turned diplomat who administered Marshall Plan funds and had very specific ideas about how that money should be used. And Lewis Douglas, the US ambassador to Britain from 1947 to 1950, who met regularly with British officials and applied relentless pressure on economic policy. These men didn't announce their intentions in public speeches. There was no press conference where they said, "We're going to break the British Empire's economic system." But in private cables, in classified memos, in quiet meetings at the State Department, they coordinated a strategy. And that strategy was simple. Use Britain's dependence on American aid to force openings in the Commonwealth trade system, and use the dollar shortage to redirect global gold flows to New York. Here's how they did it. First, the Marshall Plan money didn't just arrive as a blank check. It came with conditions administered through the Economic Cooperation Administration, which Harriman ran from Paris. Countries receiving aid had to submit detailed plans showing how they'd use the funds, and American officials would review those plans, approve or reject them, suggest changes. This gave Washington enormous leverage. When British officials wanted Marshall funds to rebuild factories or import food, American reviewers would ask, "What are you doing to promote trade liberalization? What steps are you taking to reduce Commonwealth preferences?" It wasn't written in the official agreements, but it was there in every conversation, every negotiation. Meanwhile, at the GATT talks in Geneva, Clayton was playing hardball. The British negotiator was a man named James Meade, another brilliant economist who understood exactly what Clayton wanted. And Meade kept sending cables back to London, saying essentially, "The Americans won't give us what we need on tariffs unless we make concessions on imperial preference." The British cabinet was divided. Some ministers wanted to tell the Americans to go to hell, to protect the empire trade system at all costs. But the realists knew they had no choice. Britain needed American dollars more than America needed British cooperation, so they began making cuts. Small at first, a 5% reduction here, a 10% reduction there. Tariff preferences with Canada that had been 30% were trimmed to 25, then 20. The Ottawa system was being dismantled piece by piece. And here's the beautiful, or depending on your perspective, the sinister part of the American strategy. They never forced a complete, immediate surrender. That would have caused a political explosion in London and Ottawa and Canberra. Instead, they accepted gradual reductions, knowing that once the process started, it would be impossible to reverse. Each cut weakened the system a little more, made Commonwealth countries a little more dependent on trade with America, made the whole structure a little more unstable. Now let's talk about the gold, because this is where the story gets technical but crucially important. Canada officially never joined the sterling area. The Canadian dollar was pegged to the US dollar, not the British pound. But Canadian trade was still heavily oriented toward Britain, and Canadian financial institutions had deep ties to London. So when Canadian mining companies produced gold, they had a choice: sell in London or sell in New York. Before the war, London was the obvious choice. It was the largest gold market, the most liquid, the most established. But after Bretton Woods, the calculation changed. Remember, gold was now fixed at $35 per ounce. If you sold in London, you got pounds, which you then had to convert to dollars if you wanted to buy American equipment or pay American debts. But British currency controls made that conversion difficult and expensive. There were delays, paperwork, restrictions. If you sold in New York, instant dollars. No conversion, no restrictions. Plus, American demand for gold was enormous because the dollar was the only currency fully convertible to gold under Bretton Woods. Every central bank in the world was accumulating dollars and could theoretically exchange them for gold at the US Treasury. So America needed a constant supply of gold to back the system. American officials knew this, and they made sure Canadian mining companies knew it too. US commercial attachés in Toronto, American banking representatives, even casual conversations at industry conferences. The message was consistent. Sell your gold in New York. It's easier, more profitable, more reliable. and slowly the flows began to shift. Not overnight, not in some dramatic announcement, but quarterly reports started showing more Canadian gold going to New York, less to London. By 1949, the trend was clear. By 1950, it was undeniable. Australia was a different case because it was formerly part of the sterling area. Australian gold and dollars from exports were supposed to be pooled in London under the sterling area rules. The Bank of England managed these reserves for the entire Commonwealth. But Australia was chafing under this system because it meant Australian exporters couldn't freely access the dollars they earned. Those dollars went to London, and Canberra had to ask permission to use them. After 1949, Australian officials began negotiating for more flexibility. They wanted to hold some reserves in dollars to trade more directly with the United States, and the Americans encouraged this, not openly, not in a way that would directly attack the sterling area. But when Australian trade delegations came to Washington, they were welcomed warmly. Favourable credit terms were offered. Technical assistance was provided. The implicit message was, orient your economy toward America, and we'll make it worth your while. In 1950, two things happened that sealed the shift. First, the Korean War broke out in June. Suddenly, America was spending enormous amounts of money on military production, buying materials and commodities from around the world. This pumped dollars into the global economy and ended the dollar shortage that had given Britain some breathing room. Countries that had been scraping by with limited dollar reserves were now flush with American currency. And what did they do with those dollars? Many converted them to gold in New York or simply held them as reserves, because dollars were now clearly more valuable and stable than pounds. Second, in September 1950, the British pound was devalued from $4.03 to $2.80, a massive 30% drop. This was a clear signal that the pound was no longer the stable, reliable currency it had once been. If you were a central banker in Ottawa or Canberra, watching the pound collapse in value, would you want to keep your reserves in pounds? Or would you shift to dollars and gold held in New York? The answer was obvious, and that's exactly what happened. By the end of 1950, the transformation was largely complete. Imperial tariff preferences still existed on paper, but they'd been cut so much that their practical effect was minimal. American goods were flowing into Commonwealth markets in quantities that would have been unthinkable in 1945. And gold that used to flow to London was now flowing to New York, strengthening American reserves, making the dollar even more dominant. The men who engineered this, Clayton, Harriman, Nitze, Douglas, never wrote memoirs bragging about it. In fact, Clayton retired from government service in 1947, his work essentially done. The system he set in motion continued without him. These men saw themselves as pragmatists, as defenders of American interests in a dangerous world. They would have argued that opening up world trade was good for everyone, that breaking down empire preference systems promoted efficiency and growth, that dollar dominance brought stability. And maybe they were right. Or maybe they were participants in one of the most successful economic conspiracies in modern history. The deliberate use of Marshall Plan leverage and Bretton Woods monetary rules to dismantle the British Imperial economy and replace London with New York as the centre of global finance. Here's what we know for certain. In 1945, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. London was the centre of gold trading, and the Commonwealth system meant that a quarter of global trade happened within a British-dominated zone. By 1950, the dollar was the dominant reserve currency. New York was the centre of gold trading, and Commonwealth preferences were being systematically dismantled. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because a small group of American officials saw an opportunity in Europe's post-war weakness and used every tool at their disposal, aid, trade negotiations, monetary policy, to reshape the global economy in America's favour. Were they conspirators or just effective policymakers? I'll let you decide. But think about this. The financial world we live in today, where the dollar dominates, where Wall Street sets the pace, where American economic power is unmatched, that world was born in the years between 1944 and 1950, built by men whose names most people have never heard, using methods that were never openly discussed. If this video changed how you think about post-war history, do me a favor. Share it. Send it to someone who loves this kind of deep research. Leave a comment telling me what you think. Was this justified or was it economic imperialism? And subscribe, because I'm going to keep digging into these hidden histories, these stories of power and money and conspiracy that shaped our world. The Marshall Plan saved Europe, but it also broke an empire and built an American century. And now you know how. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.